You may be happy to hear that we are pleased to welcome now our next speaker from Copenhagen. And he brings an impressive writer with him. And just let me mention several points here, just a few points. Mr. Professor Dr. Gehl, he is founding partner of Gehl Architects and has received several awards for his work. He is Professor Emeritus from the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, School of Architecture. And he also received several honorary doctorates from the universities of Edinburgh, Varna, Halifax, and Toronto, and has written, on top of it, several books. Wow, he has done really a lot, and he can tell us not only about Copenhagen, but also about other cities around the world, having worked on projects, for example, for the cities of London, Melbourne, Sydney, Amman, New York, and Moscow. It's an honor for me to invite him on stage, Mr. Professor Dr. Gehl. Professor Gehl, I hand it over to you now.
Time is short.
Yes.
It's going to be 20 minutes, the longest 20 minutes in my life. I'll talk about science meets the city, and I'll use Copenhagen and my own life as a case story in this. It's me sitting there looking at the city. What if architecture can change the world? That was a blouse which they put out in the Architecture Center in Copenhagen, and we discussed that very much. But I could say, what if science could change the city? Let's see. One of the persons I worked with has been this guy, Michael Bloomberg, mayor of New York. And he was famous for saying on every occasion, "In God we trust, but now bring me the data." And that was exactly what we did when we were working with Times Square. We found that 90% of everybody visiting Times Square was on 10% of the space in the sidewalks, very dense sidewalks, and 10% of the people were in 90% of the space in cars. That was the data needed to convince everybody that this was a bad way of using Times Square. It was changed, and just one day it completely took over something of a completely other way, and it's now a very famous place in New York. They've done 500 other places like this one. The story of my life, a very short version. I graduated in 1960, and that was a heyday of modernism, and we actually spent 5 years in university moving objects around. We always hovered over the models this height, 5 kilometers from an aeroplane, and then we placed the objects, and when the objects was a nice pattern, it was a good city. So I went out of university as a good modernist, and then I married a psychologist. And that was a new era for a young architect. That was the time when we had all the Plattenbau coming up in the sidewalk, in the suburbs. My wife and I were sitting and watching this, and that was, of course, the heyday of modernism and motorism. And these two paradigms, these two important changes in everything we ever did in cities, they really happened in 1960. It started out in the big way with modernism and motorism. That was what my wife and I was looking at, and we were doing other things. But then I had an experience in the office, a little small office, 5 people. A Christian man came and said he had a big piece of land in one of the Danish cities. It should now be used for residences, but he wanted something which was good for people. First we said, of course, everything architects do is good for people, but then we could hear it was not enough. Then, of course, I went home and started to talk with my wife, and the more we talked about it, we realized that we didn't know anything about how to make a housing area good for people. There were no research, no knowledge. Then my boss had been in Italy and saw that some people had a village around the square that looked fairly good. So we started to define that good for people is when it's just as good outside as inside, when the shared space is as good as the spaces you have inside. This interest in the public space as the meeting point of a community. It was never built, it was far too advanced in 1962, but it had a lot of implications. 10 years later, everything in Denmark looked like this. My wife and I, we had to go to Italy because we wanted to study what do people actually do in a city, how does a city work? And we thought going to Italy, they have a tradition, they have nice weather. We got money from Carlsberg and got down to Italy to drink Chianti for the money. And then we started systematically to watch how people use the city. What is a city square? What's a piazza used for? And then we made some articles in the Danish national architectural newspaper. Rumor has it, it was the first time the word people was mentioned in the architect's newspaper magazine. Then, when I was married to this psychologist, I had a very bad time because all the time the young psychologists, they asked me, why are you architects not interested in people? And why don't they teach you anything about people in School of Architecture? And why have you thought about why your professors go out 5 o'clock in the morning to take photos of the monuments to be sure there are no people in the foreground which can distract the students during the lectures? Have you thought about this? We had not thought about that. So I realized I had to go back to School of Architecture to find out what they forgot to tell me. So I went back to School of Architecture 40 more years. And I realized they didn't tell me anything about people first time I was there because we knew absolutely nothing. There was no knowledge about how form and life was interacting and how form influenced life. So we had to start on square one. In my case, I sat on my behind for 40 years and watched people. And of course, we started to realize who the client were. The client was actually the same client it's always been throughout history. Even with modernism and motorism, the client was still a slow, linear, horizontal, 5 kilometers an hour walking animal with a great interest in other people. Same client. We started to notice that behavior in all parts of the world was very similar. Here, people are waiting for the bus in 3 different continents, and all is because we are Homo sapiens, we have the same senses, the same built-in distances and whatever we have. So here they are waiting for the bus. Here are some people sitting in Moscow and some people sitting in Washington, and it's difficult to see the difference here. So we realized that there's Homo sapiens all over and there are many things are the same. We also realized in all these studies that there's much more to walking than walking. Actually, a good city, you can have many, many people walking and still it could not be a good city. A sure sign that it's a good city is when people stop walking and start to enjoy. So the more people who are not walking, the better the city is, and the better people will relate to this city as a nice city. I made up this sentence at that point that a good city is like a good party. People stay much longer than they planned because they are enjoying themselves. And that's exactly some of the things we have used ever since. We found a number of general patterns which are very logical, one of them being the edge effect, that nobody walk out in the middle of nowhere and stands there waiting for a long time. It will look very awkward and you are in the way of people and they'll start to look at you and say, what's he doing there? Shall we call the police and everything? No, we go out to the edge where we have a good view of the whole thing. All our senses are here. So all over the world, all of us, if we are to stay in a place for a longer time, we will prefer the edge, the corner sofa, the edge in the ballroom, the edge in St. Peter's Square, the edge, the edge. So we found it as a very important part of architecture, that is the edge of the buildings. Then we started, of course, to realize, will architects be like other people? And then we made very intensive studies of behavior of architectural students in various schools, and we found that the architecture students were behaving exactly as ordinary people. And then, of course, we started to wonder who put up these benches and who do they expect would sit on places like this. We don't know this. The world is full of these examples of architects not knowing the simplest thing of what they will do themselves. We don't know who put up this, but here we know it's Daniel Liebeskind who put up these contraptions. And if you do this sort of thing, I have an advice for you. Bring in some bronze people and put them there, because nobody else will go and sit there. We also, in the studies in Italy, we started to notice that the edge was very important, but also various objects. In the Campo in Siena, we noticed that nearly everything interesting in Siena happened around the bollards. So you need the edge and the corners, but also you need some support when you're out in the public space. If they took down all the bollards in Siena, there will be no public life in Siena. We found this love for support. I call it also the piano effect, that in a reception you go over to the piano, so you have some support. We found the same pattern in Guatemala with little girls and in Poland with big girls. We found the same pattern with nuns and monks. They prefer bollards. And we found it in Italy, in Australia, where they stood exactly where they were not supposed to stand, because they needed a little bit of extra to support their presence. All these things we found, and we started to put them together in books. My first book came out 50 years ago, Leben zwischen Häusern. It's now all over the world. Only 16 years later, it was published in English, and 40 years later than the publishing originally, it came out in German. And I heard from the Jovis Verlag in Berlin that there was no market in German for this kind of literature. It came out anyway. My experience has been that by far the most important things I've done in my life is to systematize, to get the data, and to get the data communicated. And the most important things I've done is not all the conferences and all the students and whatever, but that are the books, which are now out in 40 languages. So by doing the research and the books, you can change the mindset of people. And my experience is that to change the city, you first need to change the mindset. Then it's very easy to change the city when people can understand what you're doing. I'll tell you a little bit about my hometown of Copenhagen. Copenhagen has now been for 60 years hooked on a project of humanizing the city, of putting people first in city planning. It started in 1962, where they took out the traffic from the main street in Copenhagen. That was very, very early. 62 was the same year as Jane Jacobs was writing her famous book in New York, saying also motorism and modernism will lead to the end of cities, no great cities no more. At the same time in Copenhagen, they started to take out the traffic. There was great discussion. We were told it will never work in Denmark because we are Danes, we are not Italians, and it's too cold furthermore. And then they took out the traffic, and next year we started to be Italians very fast. And we have become more and more Italians, the more space we've got to be Italians in, because we are Homo sapiens, as are the Italians. So that was a success. And then gradually, all the squares in Copenhagen were cleared of traffic and made into people spaces. All the waterfronts in Copenhagen, which were used for parking, because they thought that the cars should have a nice place to rest when they worked for us. with a good view, but then they thought maybe we can use these spaces for better purposes, and then they started systematically to turn all the waterfronts into people spaces. Now, because I'm a very old man, I can see more clearly what has happened. I can see that in the 50 years we are talking about, we had 3 centers in the world where the relationship between form and life was studied. That was the New York School with Jane Jacobs and Holly White. There was the Berkeley School with Alan Jacobs and Claire Cooper Marcus and Christopher Alexander and a number of other brilliant guys. And then there was the Copenhagen School centered around the School of Architecture in Copenhagen. The difference between these schools were that we were in a small city and in a small country, and that we used Copenhagen to do our studies all the time, and that came to have an enormous influence on the policies in Copenhagen, because we are small in Denmark, so everybody knows everybody else. We know the mayors and the politicians, and they know us at the School of Architecture, and it was my former students who are now city planning. So they came running over to School of Architecture all the time and say, what shall we do next? So Copenhagen became the first city in the world where the life of the city was systematically recorded and published. Just as the traffic engineers all the time had counted all the cars and all the data about traffic was known, but no data about life in the city was available. But now in Copenhagen, already in the 60s, we had these studies, and they have been continued ever after. We were able to prove very, very distinctly that more and more people were walking in the city, the better the conditions for walking were. We could see the change from people being chased by the cars to people being free of the cars to where the purpose was shopping. But now later on and today, people go to the city to do recreation. It's part of the leisure time society. If you ask people 20 years ago, why are you in the city? They will say, I'm here to shop, of course. Why do you ask? Now they say, why are you in the city? I'm here in the city to be in the city. Why do you ask? Do you shop? Yeah, it happens. I go and see what's available, but I'm here to enjoy myself. Leisure time society. We could prove that every time you took away a parking lot or provided 14 square meters for people, we had another person staying in the city. So the life in the city was going up, both walking and those enjoying the city, the better they made the city. And that was very inspirational for the politicians and for everyone. And now we've seen this fantastic development of Copenhagen in these 60 years, that more and more spaces have been made available and more interesting, nice things are happening, especially in the good season, in the summer season. Of course, they have in Copenhagen now a strategy made by the city council. We will be the best city in the world for people. And some of the examples of these strategies are that all the old streets look like this one, up just asphalt, and now they're all of them just 2 lanes of cars, one good median in the middle to rest and to look out for traffic, then street trees, bicycle lanes, and sidewalks. This lower street is much more beautiful, it's much more safe for all people, and it can take the same number of traffic as the old street could, because the traffic engineers have become much smarter in the meantime. Also part of this making it the best city in the world for people is this, that they have this idea of continuous sidewalks, never stop a sidewalk and a bicycle lane. Let the Mercedes-Benz guys wait and let the people pass. They could have a priority as well as the cars. That's just turning it about. That's a very nice humanistic treat. But it's fantastic for my granddaughter, Laura, who is 7, who can now walk all the way to school herself because she can stay on the sidewalk, doesn't have any roads to cross anymore. My daughter tells me it's wonderful. Laura tells me it's wonderful. We have a statement from the Mayor of Planning and Environment that without the public life research done by the School of Architecture, we politicians would never have dared to make Copenhagen the most livable city in the world. She told me that all this information and data has been extremely instrumental in their political debates about where to go with Copenhagen. I could tell you a lot about bicycling. I haven't got the time. But I'll warn you here in Munich, if you do too much good for the bicyclists, actually what we did was to make a complete citywide, good, safe bicycle network where always the parked cars are protecting the bicycles instead of what I saw yesterday here, that you had the bicycles to protect the parked cars. That is the other way around. So you have a good bicycle network and more people bike, but then, Cologne, you have new problems. You may have serious congestion on the bicycle lanes. What do you do? In Copenhagen, we just widened the bicycle lanes and put in more bicycle lanes. Where do we get the asphalt from? We took it from the motor cars. So all this story about the bicycles is that over the years, an impressive new culture of using bicycle has popped up. Half of everybody now comes to the city to work and to study on their bicycles. 10 years ago, it was 38%. So what have we learned from Copenhagen? We have known for years that if you provide more streets, you will have more traffic of cars. But in Copenhagen, we have learned, and we have data, and we have proved it, that if you provide better conditions for walking, for public life, and for bicycling, you will have more of that instead of more traffic. But of course, it's a very drastic cure to put to a city, an innocent city, to narrow the lanes and make fewer lanes for cars and take away parking spaces, all that. What happens when you do all these awful things to a city? Yeah, the Minister of Culture may start to read some really good literature, but more important, she have made this Danish architectural official policy, put people first when you do your architecture. What happens when you do all this to a city like Copenhagen? You are visited by 400 delegations every year to hear how you did it. What happens when you do all these dramatic changes? Yes, they picked my favorite research assistant and later on my colleague in consultant. They picked her to be the city architect, and I can now sleep in peace every night. I know it's the one who knows most about people in cities who is now being city architect. And lo and behold, what happens? They put this person on the bus stops and on the metro doors, saying that we realize that Copenhagen today is a product of the work done by the scientists in the School of Architecture in Copenhagen, and they picked on me as a leader to be put on the bus stops. You cannot reach higher in a Nordic society where we have special laws not to raise too high. You cannot get higher than in your lifetime you can see your face on the bus stops. What happens if you do all these bad things to a city? You are named the most livable city in the world, one time after the other. So if we ask the question, can science change the city? Yes, it can. And then I'll have last words for you. We've even written down how to do it, how to study public life. It's ready. And it's even ready in German, which is the good news here. And that was my final remark. Thank you very much.